Hey everyone, I'm Tobi and welcome back to my channel where I talk about bookish related things. And in today's video, I'll be talking about the 6 books that I read in July. Had a pretty good reading month, found a new all-time favourite, which is always fun. Let's pretend this is not sweat and that I'm just glowing. I'm shining because I will progressively get hotter throughout this video, but heat wave, global warming, climate change, yay. Anyways, the first book that I read in July was The Outsider by Albert Camus or Camus. And he is an oh my gosh. And he is an Algerian author, and this is translated from the French into English by Sandra Smith. So we're following this character in Algeria, and this man, we start off where his mother has passed, and honestly one of the most amazing lines in this novel, it's probably one of the best first lines I've read, is, "My mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know." And that line already kind of captures the narrative and the soul of this modern classic, as the character that we follow is very unwilling to want to conform to society's expectations of emotions and how you should feel or act in certain situations or certain circumstances. And he's a bit of an existentialist, I'd say, kind of pondering a lot about life's purpose and what actually brings joy or brings value in life. However, the plot really picks up when the protagonist ends up committing this pretty random act of violence one day on this beach in Algeria, and he goes on trial. You really see how his emotions, or maybe lack of, well, at least overt emotions, is used in the trial. Like when it comes to his mother's passing, people saying that, oh, I would have expected, more tears or screaming or just general sorrow because of his mother's passing. And it's just interesting to see how lawyers would paint him as this violent, awful, horrible person. This book is a really, really wonderful exploration into humanity, into freedom, religion, societal expectations, grief as well. As I feel like I enjoyed how it explored that grief actually doesn't always have to be this all-consuming, extremely negative emotion. I'm not going to pretend like the protagonist in this book was really interesting to read from. It's very dull, apathetic head to be stuck in, but I understand that that was intentional and necessary for the narrative. It just wasn't as fun to read, if I'm being completely frank. However, the last section of this book, it becomes so like frantic, as this like frenzy. All of a sudden there's a lot of emotion. It's just becomes intense, and that last bit, that last scene of the book will stick with me. That will stick with me. It's very impactful, especially the way it kind of dives into religion and also just the whole purpose of life and the idea of freedom and taking freedom for granted. I completely understand why this is a modern classic. I gave it 4 stars. Definitely not a new fave, just because the protagonist's voice was so dull and apathetic that I'm not gagging to read from his point of view again, but it was still a really solid book. The next book I read was My Pen is the Wing of a Bird, new fiction by Afghan women. And I spoke about this book in my last video, in my Reading Around the World series. So this is an anthology, and it is a collection of 18 short stories written by Afghan women, and it's translated from both the Dari and the Pashto into English. And this is a gorgeous short story collection. My goodness, I gave this 5 stars. The most important part of it is that these are the voices of Afghan women. These narratives are owned by them. It's just amazing to see the talent of all of these 18 different women, because there was no bad story in this collection. Of course, there were stories which were more compelling, stories which were more impactful or just shocking or more interesting, but none of them were actually bad. Like, I was just so eager to get to the next, to the next, to the next. Like, they were wonderful. They were all like the right length for what they needed to be, and there was such a range of different topics and social commentary that was explored in all of these stories. We had contemplation about one's identity and their gender. We have wars that are happening. We have people journeying to work and how they're on the brink of life and death just as they're trying to go about their normal day. Exploration into polygamy and into family relationships, into marriages, into loneliness and isolation. And of course, a lot of these short stories are inspired by true events, and they actually explicitly say what event they're inspired by, if that is the case. So of course, there are some really heartbreaking stories. There's a lot of despair and tragedy in these stories, but there's also so much hope and love and joy in the pages of this book. And this is a very accessible book. It's very easy to read. The translations have been done superbly. The stories are all grounded in reality, very just relatable, a lot of them. It doesn't matter where you're from, a lot of these stories are relatable. And I think it's amazing that Untold, which is this writers development program that worked with all of these 18 women one-on-one, and they work with also people in many conflict or post-conflict countries, and worked with these women one-on-one to develop these amazing stories and to really just bring to life these ideas and narratives that were in their head and put it on paper, get them translated so that they can be shared worldwide, globally, which is what we need. We need these narratives from these women, and the fact we have that now. It took 2 years to create this collection, and it is just gorgeous. This is one I highly recommend, that I can widely recommend as well to pretty much everyone. The next story I read, this has become a new all-time favorite, and that is Earthlings by Sayaka Murata, and it's translated from the Japanese into English by Ginny, Tapley, Takemori. Obviously 5 stars. I did not know what to expect when I went into this book, because I read Convenient Store Women earlier this year, which have very similar social commentary when it comes to talking about how homogenous society is, how all these societal norms and expectations are infringed so heavily upon individuals' lives, and if you try to deter at all from what society says is expected and normal of you, people just freak out, people put pressure on you, you'll be ostracized, isolated, alienated. And although that is the exact same sort of social commentary that comes through in Earthlings, this one was done in a much more interesting, very dark and weird and at times gross way, and I was so here for it, because it's literary fiction meets some horror meets weirdness, and yes, that is what I love. In the book, we're following this girl initially who believes that she's an alien. She doesn't think she's an earthling, essentially. She doesn't think she's actually human. She thinks she has powers, and as you read the book, you realize that these powers she thinks she has are essentially coping mechanisms for the life she's living and certain ways that she's treated from people around her. Every summer she goes on this family kind of retreat to the mountains with all the extended family, and she has this really close relationship with her cousin, and her cousin also believes that he's an alien. And again, it's similar-ish to the protagonist, where it's essentially because of the way he's treated that he feels alienated. That's essentially the case. They feel alienated, so end up taking it to the extreme that they believe they're actually aliens, because it's children and their imagination, you know. However, certain events transpire during one of these summer retreats with the family, and from that you really see how it impacts the protagonist and even the cousins to their lives. And then we follow the protagonist as she's growing up. She's married to an asexual man, and she's very content in her marriage. Like, that marriage is essentially of convenience. It means she gets less questions from friends, family, and can just be her, do her. Her husband is not interfering in her life and how she is. Her and her husband essentially start finding a common ground about how they feel othered from society and that doesn't have to be a bad thing, and they can find their own way of living and their own rules for life. Like, why should they have to conform to what society says, to what the Earthlings say? And then you see how these small ideas essentially get bigger, and they take them quite literally, and then we just go from there. And then there are many left turns, skirt made in this novel. You can't even guess where the story will go. I was just gobsmacked. My jaw was on the floor at the end of this novel. Like, what? How did we get here? Like, how did we get here? But however we did get there, I was thrilled. I loved that Murata is just not afraid to take her narratives and stories to extremely weird and dark and grim places. And it wasn't even so much really just for shock horror. Like, it did have a purpose, it did serve the narrative well, and it will impact you, it will stay with you, it will make your mind tick, 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 and you will think a lot about society, about what alienating and othering others, the impact that can have on them, and just about generally being different, whether that's you're neurodivergent or you're part of the LGBTQIA plus community, certain things you've experienced when you're younger and how that can impact you and cause you to want to withdraw from society and people. And it's, yeah, just the social commentary itself might not have been groundbreaking, but the way Murata explored it and demonstrated it with this narrative, this plot, with these characters was just insane, and definitely won't be for everyone. If you don't like any body horror, if you don't like it when books get just extremely weird and quite dark, probably not for you. There are quite a lot of trigger warnings in this book, so I will link them down in the description box below. Now that I know that this kind of book, this kind of narrative is actually more what Murata is known for, is actually her thing. Now I'm so excited to read other works of hers that's been translated into the English, and I'm so excited to pick up Life Ceremony, which is a short story collection, which are very much stories of this same caliber. So it's a very far cry from Convenience Store Women, and although Convenience Store Women is definitely more accessible, definitely can be recommended more widely to more people, I just love how different Earthlings is, and it's a new all-time favourite. I could go on about it forever, so let me just move on to the next. And the next book that I read was Paradais by Fernanda, Melchor, and it's translated from the Spanish into English by Sophie Hughes. This book is classic Melchor narrative, where we're, rather than following a whole village this time like in hurricane season, we're following this housing complex, like luxury housing complex in Mexico, as Melchor is a Mexican writer, and we're following mainly these two characters. We have Franco, who is this very spoiled, rich, just gross, lonely boy. And then we're following Polo, and we're actually just reading from Polo's point of view, who is a gardener who works in this luxury housing complex, Paradais. However, he doesn't live there. He's grown up pretty poor, and, you know, he's faced certain things in his past, just abuse and very difficult familial relationships. Franco and Polo essentially strike up a friendship of convenience. Neither of them care for each other, or actually really like each other, but there's someone for Franco, he gets to rant about his really gross, obsessive fantasies and very sexual fantasies that he has about a neighbor. And then Polo has someone who has money, who can afford to buy alcohol and cigarettes, and just someone to kind of just hate on the world with. And yeah, they strike up this friendship of convenience. They're both like kind of 15, 16. The conversations they have are, yeah, they're pretty bleh. We see how the conversations get increasingly more frantic, more intense, and certain ideas that have been discussed go from very theoretical and hypothetical to actual reality and a plan that is put in motion. And then we see how a certain horrific act ends up being committed, and we've kind of following the lead up to the act being committed. We don't know what actually is going to happen. You can guess along the lines from the conversations that are happening what could happen, but those last pages when shit went down essentially were intense, were gripping. However, majority of the book is more quiet because what Melchor is more interested in is just that social commentary and really microscopic look. Is this my magnifying glass? But microscopic look into Mexican culture, particularly into socioeconomic inequality and the very entrenched machismo and misogyny that is so embedded in the culture. And just, it's a very unflinching and bleak look and portrait of that side of Mexican culture. Of course, all of Mexican culture isn't this very toxic machismo vibe, but that is what Melchor loves to focus on and hone it in on. Her writing and narratives are extremely claustrophobic, and I think what she's capturing amazingly is how all these characters want to escape their environment. They want to escape their circumstances. They want better for themselves. However, they just never seem to be able to escape these places, escape who they're going to become and what they've already deemed to become because of their nature, because of the environment they've grown up in, because of all that they've seen in their life and all that they know. And the fact that Melchor is able to capture that feeling and that just claustrophobic being trapped in your life in these pages, in her writing, in these narratives is wonderful. That's the same for Hurricane Season, that very just claustrophobic feeling trapped. No one can escape who they are, unfortunately, and who they are is made up of their upbringing and the amount of money they have and class, wealth. Again, this is just a wonderful, another, well, bleak portrait of Mexico by Melchor, but of course it was written amazingly. Again, it was a solid 4 stars. Definitely not as intense or as dark as Hurricane Season, so this novella is more accessible, I would say, so I can recommend this one more than I could recommend Hurricane Season. I do prefer Hurricane Season, but I still think Paradise is wonderful, and I would recommend, if you want to have a taste of Melchor's writing, you're not sure if you'd be able to stomach Hurricane Season because the very violent, misogynistic, stomach-churning language is abundant. It's abundant in the pages. So if you want to figure out if Melchor is a writer for you, start off with Paradise for sure, and then you can dip your toes into Hurricane Season at your own risk, please, at your own risk. I will link down the content warnings for both Paradise and Hurricane Season actually in the description box. One quick thing, if you enjoy reading books where characters have redeemable arcs or they're morally grey, this isn't for you. These characters are straight up awful, no redemption is happening, even got slightly unreliable narrator. So if that sounds a bit more up your street or you don't mind that, then Paradise is definitely a book you could enjoy. The next book I read was a 4.5 stars, and it's probably, I would say, my favourite horror book that I've read to date. I haven't actually read loads and loads of horror, but this, a little bit of me. Stolen Tongues by Felix Blackwell. And this book actually started off on reddit.com from what I understand, the like horror side of Reddit. The horror community no sleep. I don't want to give too much of the plot away just because, I mean, when it comes to horror, I feel like the not knowing is a big part of what creates that very tense atmosphere. But overall vague plot is that we're following this couple who go to the cabin for this romantic getaway. So they go there to celebrate their engagement. However, they're not really able to relax up there because they're hearing lots of different noises, from children's screams for help to very mournful cries, screams of animals, and yeah, that's all I will say. There's a certain horror lurking there that they just can't seem to escape from. And also, if you're someone who gets freaked out by like sleep talking or sleepwalking, maybe give this one a miss. It actually scared me so much. Like, I was actually terrified at times when reading the book. Like, I was on my Kindle and I'd be like turning the pages like that because I was just so like, oh my gosh, tense and stressed and freaked out. And I genuinely did have to sleep with the lights on that evening when I finished the book because I was just so so disturbed, which is what I wanted though. Like I was disturbed in the best way possible. It's not a book really that is like kind of body horror or like gross or disgusting or like jump scare. It's just this very chilling, tense, uncomfortable, on edge atmosphere that is maintained wonderfully throughout the entire novel. So it means like when it comes to actually like the big reveal of like, oh, like what's going on, what's happening, that became secondary, because just in every single page the just horror and discomfort and just very chilling atmosphere that was seeping through every single page. You weren't even too fussed about like, oh, what does this number 5 mean, or blah 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 blah. You were just like, oh my gosh, what is gonna happen next? Like it just was, yeah, the atmosphere, and that's what I love. I love it when the entire book is just spooky and scary, and Blackwell managed to capture that wonderfully. I won't pretend that the characters were extremely interesting. They were pretty two-dimensional. Big reveal, to be honest, slightly underwhelming. The story definitely did become a bit repetitive at times, but it didn't matter. It didn't matter because that atmosphere, as I said, was maintained wonderfully throughout. One little caveat though. So there was this Native American folklore and Native American characters that are weaved into the narrative, and I initially really enjoyed that. I love finding out more and reading more about Native American culture. And then in the epilogue he was giving very self-righteous white savior energy, and I was like, no, wasn't really here for it. So that was a shame. So definitely have that in mind when you are reading the book, if that's something that you wouldn't be comfortable reading. But the overall book though still was amazing. I did enjoy the way the Native American folklore was weaved into the story. I thought that made it very interesting, but of course it's a massive shame to kind of know that the representation is a little bit I don't know, a little bit pompous. And then the final book that I read in July was my least favourite one, and that was To Be Taught If Fortunate by Becky Chambers. And this is a sci-fi novel. I think this is a book you would enjoy if you genuinely just love science, because that is at the forefront of this book. Because the character study is pretty limited, the plot pretty lackluster, so it's really the science itself that is explored pretty well, I'd say, in this book. Just I don't have as much personal interest in space and science like that. So for me, I was really hoping it's going to be the characters and the plot that was going to capture me and make me fall in love. But I was not enamored with the characters the same way I was like with A Psalm for the Wild Build. As I said, the plot to me was pretty lackluster. Not too much happened. And because I wasn't invested in the characters, it meant with very minimal plot, I was just kind of like, okay. And this book wasn't bad, like bad by any means. It just was very mediocre. It was a 3 stars for me. Oh, the actual plot. So it's the 22nd century, and we're following this astronaut and her crew as they go off into space to explore different worlds in the universe. I'm gonna have to read this off the blur because I've really forgotten the plot already. But they're able to explore these worlds through this revolutionary method known as somaforming, which means that the astronauts can survive in hostile environments off Earth using these synthetic biological supplementations. So now the human body is no longer a limitation to exploring the galaxy and just the wonders of space and outer space. So I thought that was a really cool concept. I loved that. And also what I did enjoy was the exploration into the morality and ethics of space exploration. So yeah, these are the 6 books that I read in July. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you've read any of these books, let me know. Let's talk in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you want to join this chaotic corner of the internet, then subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.